Chapter 20. It was pouring with rain when George walked home that afternoon. Cold splats of water hurtled down from the dark grey sky as he trudged along. Cars dived through the big puddles at the edge of the road, sending tidal waves of dirty water swooshing over the pavement. By the time George reached his own street, he was shivering with cold. As he got as far as Eric's door and hovered anxiously on the doorstep. He was longing to ring the bell and ask the scientist to help him with his talk for the next day. And he also wanted to find out why Dr. Reaper might think he had disappeared, but he was worried Eric would still be cross with him and send him away. To ring or not to ring? What to do? The skies were getting darker and darker, and suddenly he heard a huge clap of thunder. The rain got even heavier, and George made up his mind. It was important to ask Eric about his talk and to tell him about Dr. Reaper. He decided to be brave and ring the bell. Bing bong! He waited for a few seconds and nothing happened. Just as he was wondering whether to ring again, the door flew open and Eric's head popped out. "George," he said in delight, "it's you! Come in!" He reached out a long arm and whisked George inside, shutting the front door with a brisk slam. To his great surprise, George found himself standing in Eric's hallway, his wet coat dripping on the bare floorboards. "I'm so sorry," he stammered. "What for?" asked Eric, looking a bit startled. "What have you done?" "About Annie, and the comet, and Cosmos," George reminded him. "Oh, that," said Eric. "I'd forgotten all about it. But now that you mention it, don't worry. Annie told me that it was her idea, not yours, and that she made you go into outer space. I take it that's true." He looked at George over his heavy glasses, his bright eyes twinkling. Yes, actually it is," said George with relief. "So really," he continued Eric, "I should be saying sorry to you for jumping to the wrong conclusion. Instead of considering all the evidence, I just applied some common sense, otherwise known as prejudice, and came up with a totally wrong answer." George didn't really understand all of this, so he just nodded. From the library he could hear the sound of voices. "Are you having a party?" he asked. "Well, yes, a sort of party," said Eric. "It's a party of scientists, so we like to call it a conference. Why don't you come inside and listen? You might be interested. We're talking about Mars. Annie's had to miss it, I'm afraid, as she's still at her granny's. You can tell her about it if you stay." "Oh, yes, please," said George, forgetting in his excitement to ask about his talk or tell Eric about Dr. Reaper. As he took off his wet coat and followed Eric into the library, he could hear a woman's voice. "This is the reason why my colleagues and I strongly advocate the thorough search of our closest neighbour. Who knows, in the end, what we might find by digging underneath the red surface." Eric and George tiptoed into the library. It looked quite different from the last time George had seen it. All the books were neatly arranged on shelves, pictures of the universe hung on the wall in frames, and in the corner lay a pile of carefully folded spacesuits. In the middle of the room, on rows of chairs, sat a group of scientists who were all different shapes and sizes and looked like they came from all over the world. Eric showed George to a seat, a finger pressed to his lips to show that George should keep very quiet. Standing at the front of the room was the speaker, a tall, beautiful woman with a plait of thick red hair, so long it reached right down past her waist. Her green eyes glittered as she smiled at the scientists gathered for the conference. Just above her head, Cosmos's window portal was showing the red planet. The red-haired speaker continued her talk. "Isn't it highly probable that evidence of life, had life existed on Mars in long gone times, is not there for us to find on the surface? We should never forget that every now and then sandstorms radically alter the planet's surface, burying deeper and deeper beneath layers of inorganic dust the entire past of our red neighbour." As she spoke, they all saw through Cosmos's window an enormous sandstorm that took over the whole surface of the red planet. Eric bent his head towards George and whispered, "What she means is that even if there was once life on Mars, we wouldn't see it on the surface today. In fact, I can tell you this scientist strongly believes that there is life on Mars at some stage. She sometimes even declares that there still is life there. That would be one of the most amazing discoveries of all time. But we can't say much more than that at this stage. But we need to get onto the beautiful red planet ourselves to find out." George was about to ask why Mars was red, but realised the speaker was finishing her talk. "Do you have any questions before we have a short break?" she asked her audience. "After tea and biscuits, we will discuss our last and most important issue." George felt very sad that he had only heard the end of her talk, so he raised his hand to ask something. Meanwhile, all the scientists were murmuring, "Ooh, tea." None of them wanted to ask a question. "So let's have our well-deserved tea break then," said Eric, who hadn't spotted George's raised hand. The scientists rushed over to the tea table in the corner of the room, anxious to nab all the jammy dodgers before the others could scoff them. But the red-haired speaker had noticed George's thin arm waving in the air. "Well, well," she said, looking at George. "Colleagues, we do have a question after all, and it's from our new fellow down here." The other scientists turned and looked at George. When they saw how small he was, they all smiled and brought their cups of tea and biscuits back to their seats. "What would you like to know?" asked the speaker. Please, if you don't mind," said George, suddenly feeling very shy. He wondered if his question was a really stupid one and whether everyone would laugh at him. He took a deep breath. Why is Mars red?" he asked. "Good question," said one of the other scientists, blowing his tea. George breathed a sigh of relief. Professor Krizak, the red-haired speaker, whose name no one ever managed to pronounce, nodded and started to give George an answer. "If you walk through the hills and mountains here on Earth, you can sometimes see red patches of ground that are not covered with plants. This is true, for instance, in the Grand Canyon in the United States. But there are many other places where this is also the case. The ground is the red colour because there is iron there that has rusted. When iron becomes oxidised, which is another way of saying it has rusted, it becomes red. It is because of the presence of the oxidised iron, rusted iron, that the surface of Mars is red." "Do you mean that Mars is made out of iron?" asked George. "Well, not quite. Since we sent some robots to Mars, we know that it is just a thin layer of rusted iron powder that gives Mars its red colour. It seems that underneath the layer of red dust, the surface of Mars may be quite similar to the surface of the Earth without the water, that is." "So there is no water on Mars?" "There is, but the water we know is not liquid. On Mars, it's far too hot during the day. Any water turns into vapour and is lost. So the only place where the water can remain are those where the temperature always remains cold day and night, so that water can freeze and remain frozen. This happens at the poles. At the North Pole of Mars, we have found large quantities of frozen water, ice. It is the same on Earth, where large ice reservoirs can be found at the poles in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Does that answer your question?" "Yes, thank you," said George. He was just busy thinking up another question when Eric stood up at the front of the room next to the speaker. "Thank you, Professor Krizak," he said, "for a very interesting paper on Mars." Professor Krizak bowed and went to take her seat. "Dear friends and colleagues," continued Eric, "before we move on to the last and most important issue we have to discuss, let me thank you all for making the effort to get here. Some of you have come from far across the globe, but I know the talks that we have heard today have made the journey worthwhile. I'm sure I need hardly remind you how important it is that the existence of Cosmos stays a closely guarded secret." The group nodded in agreement. "Now," continued Eric, "the question we all came to answer is a question of fundamental interest for everyone who is involved in science. We all know far too well how it can be used for evil purposes, and that is why we have all taken the oath of the scientists, so that science is used only for good of humanity. But we are now facing our dilemma. As you heard in the news and saw at the Eco March on Saturday, more and more people are concerned about the state of the Earth. So, the question we now have to answer is, should we concentrate on finding ways to improve life on Earth and face its problems, or should we try and find another planet for humanity to inhabit?" All the scientists in the room were silent and looked very serious. George watched them as they wrote an answer on a little piece of paper. Eric collected the papers into a hat. In total, including Eric and the red-haired speaker, 8 scientists had voted. Eric then started to open up the papers one by one. The Earth, another planet, another planet, another planet, the Earth, another planet. Well, well, said Eric, it seems we have a split vote. The red-haired Professor Krizak put her hand up. May I make a suggestion? She asked. Everyone else nodded. She got to her feet. George, she said, addressing the boy directly. We may lack a bit of perspective on this matter because we are all specialists in our field. So you could maybe tell us what you think about it. All the scientists were looking at him now. George felt very shy and stayed silent for a few seconds. Say what you really think, whispered Professor Krizak. Twisting his fingers in his lap, George thought about his parents and the Green Campaigners. He then thought about the excitement of travelling in space and trying to find another home out there. And then he heard himself say to the scientists, Why can't we do both? Why can't you do both?